All right, maybe we should get started. All right, hi everyone. Welcome back to the AMD seminar series. We are happy to have you with us. Today, we are excited to have a panel discussion on the topic of market design for transportation platforms. We are honored and delighted to have three distinguished panelists with us. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment. But before that, I want to make a quick comment about our plan for the next hour together. So our plan is that we're going to use the first half of our time together for a few questions that we have prepared just to get things started. But then we save the second half for the Q&A from the audience. That said, even during the first half, if you have comments and questions that are related to our discussion, feel free to raise your hand. We're gonna enable speaking, and you can share your thoughts and comments with us. So our goal is to keep this as interactive as possible. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our panelists. Our first panelist is Sar Gold. Sar is the chief data scientist at VIA. He received his PhD in economics from Stanford University. And in addition to many years of industry experience, he was also an adjunct professor at NYU Polytechnic School of Engineering. Sar, thank you so much for joining us. We are very happy to have you. We are also delighted to have Tim Garciano with us. Tim is the head of data science at Convoy. He's also an economist. He received his PhD from Washington State University. And in addition to many years of industry experience, he also has academic experience and was an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. Tim, thank you for joining us today. And last but not least, we are very happy to have Professor David Schmois with us. David is the Leib Acheson Professor and Director of the Center for Data Science for Enterprise and Society at Cornell University. David is a computer scientist, and he received his PhD from UC Berkeley. David has contributed to many applications in our area of operations, and that includes designing ride-sharing and bike-sharing systems in collaboration with companies such as Motivate and Lyft. David, thanks so much for joining us. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And with that, we'd like to start the discussion by asking our panelists to tell us a little bit about their work in the area of transportation platforms, with a little bit of history, how they got interested in this area, when they saw potential in this kind of platforms, and also how they envision this field is going to go forward. We can go in any order.
So maybe I'll jump in first. I entered the area through bike sharing. And really, I was much more of a pure academic at the time. I had dabbled a little bit here and there in a few application areas, but really was much more academic focused. And saw a presentation by someone from Transportation Alternatives, an NGO based in New York City, about the coming arrival of City Bike to New York. And she spoke maybe a little too assertively about the extent to which data was going to be made available about the way in which the system was getting used. But it certainly was just like, oh my God, if this is going to be out there, what are the opportunities? And it was really through the formation of Cornell Tech, which was really set up as an institution to promote engagement with commercial enterprise and especially entrepreneurial enterprise in the surrounding community, that through which that I was able to make contact with City Bike at that point, just before they were taken over by Motivate, and really just realized that this was an area for which understanding how mechanisms for meeting supply and demand were not well understood, and there was just a great opportunity for doing that. So that was really my entry point.
I can go next. Let's see. So how did I get into ride sharing? In part, it's because I've known the founders of VIA for over 25 years. We were friends from high school, from the army. We went to the same program in the army. We went to Stanford at the same time. And so I've known of VIA since before there was VIA, and of kind of was following from the sidelines until at some point, at some point I was called, basically told me that it's time to stop playing on the sidelines and get into the field and start actually doing stuff. But I was interested in it both because these are very hard computational problems. The field of transportation is crucial for the environment, for congestion, for things like that. And also, as an academic, one of the main themes of my dissertation from back in the day was market thickness and how market thickness affects market outcomes. And transportation is one of those areas where market thickness, like how many, or specifically, kind of if we think about matching, how many drivers are out there, how many vehicles are out there, and how many people need to get from one place to the next. The rate of arrivals of riders, the rate of drivers becoming available is a huge determinant, and that's exactly one of the things that I've worked in even during my my PhD. So it was very, very interesting, and we've progressed a lot. So you know, VIA moved from the ride-sharing business into the public transit space. Initially, as VIA started, we tried to go into the public transit space, but no one would talk to us. So we set up a ride-sharing company to prove the technology. Once we proved the technology, it's clear that the same technology can be used to make public transit systems much more efficient, and which is what we do now. And we're kind of the ride-sharing business is a tiny part of what we do now, tiny and in relative terms shrinking. And I think that this is so making public transit much more efficient is a hugely important endeavor because of again the implications for the environment and for congestion and things like that. And so kind of being part of that is a huge thing. And the interesting thing is that I think actually we're finally actually getting some traction. Transportation systems are now, like we're starting to get into, well, starting. We're in hundreds of cities around the world, so it's no longer the real beginning. But going forward, the efficiencies that you can get through additional kind of both algorithmic mechanisms and market mechanisms are very important for outcomes, for both the environment and for business outcomes. So it's very cool.
Excellent. Well, so I'm a relative newcomer probably to the space, although as an economist, long been interested in markets and networks. My background is in causal inference, and so I spent the early part of my career working with technology companies to run large-scale experiments, sort of initially exposed to sort of large networks of drivers at Amazon, where I was doing some experiments on Amazon's workforce of sort of temporary drivers. These are drivers that will contract, and you'll probably seen them deliver a package to your door out of their own vehicle often. And that was really even though I was working on the labor force side and planning and understanding sort of how supply of labor responded to different incentives and different sort of environmental structure around the labor contract, really started to get interested in the other part of the problem, which is sort of the routing and how do you make that supply as efficient as possible. And from there, when Convoy approached me a couple of years ago to come and help them think about building out their digital freight marketplace, was then at that point really intrigued. And the Convoy model is a little different than rideshare. We're focused on long-haul trucking, like Sar mentioned, though, really motivated by the potential to remake a massive industry that has a very large environmental impact. And so increasing the efficiency at which this industry operates has a huge potential to reduce the environmental impact of it. So really interesting blend of sort of economic theory and how our marketplace operates. I'm particularly interested in how we do a lot of the matchmaking. We use a lot of auction theory in order to make sure that we find the right truck for the right amount of work. But then also a lot of really interesting routing problems and merchandising problems that go into that. And so I work with all of the data science teams kind of across our core marketplace at Convoy, and how we think about bringing, it's a two-sided marketplace. So how do we match demand and supply together to get not only sort of achieve our goals as a business, but how do we cut down on that waste and efficiency, improve outcomes for all of the participants in the marketplace, which a little different maybe than rideshare. It's a B2B model. So obviously the shippers are enterprises, but the truck drivers themselves are also small business owners. That's sort of the dominant model in the industry. So slightly different from a consumer model, where you're also really trying to build a marketplace that enables both sides to grow their own enterprise.
All right, great, thank you so much. So one kind of small follow-up question. I think building on what Sar mentioned, I think one vision going forward is to make public transit more efficient, right? So, and that's going to make a big impact both environmentally and also in terms of efficiency. Any other kind of direction or vision that you'd like to share with us in terms of how these transportation platforms can make an impact going forward?
I mean, another big aspect is of equity. I don't know if that's the topic of today's conversation, but there are many, especially in the US, there are many places that are basically transit deserts and have no public transit. And income inequality is very highly reflected in access to transportation inequality. And so by making transportation much more efficient and making it scalable in places where it's very hard to actually maintain a classic public transit infrastructure, that makes a huge difference. So if you think about kind of what does it take in order to maintain a real, like a fixed line transit system where buses go based on schedules and pick up people kind of at their bus stops, you can only have that in very dense areas, and places that have kind of sub-threshold density get subpar quality of service, and basically the whole thing just breaks apart. And so if you have the technology that allows you to serve people with reasonable quality of service, so for example, you never walk more than 5 minutes, and you never have to wait more than 10 minutes, and you never have to make a transfer, for example, that's better than the experience of most people with the current kind of classic public transit technology. And being able to provide that in areas that are less dense, less rich, don't have as many and as many resources, can lead to immense growth and immense like economic growth, kind of more social equality and access to everything from jobs to schools to hospitals and stuff like that. And so kind of bringing a change to kind of the equation of how much does it cost and what are the implications of providing transit can change the kind of the social landscape, because transportation is beyond the environmental impact. 15 to 25% of an average household expenditure. And so being able to provide affordable public transit in some areas is a real game changer for some people. And we focus on that a lot as well. And again, that requires kind of changing, if you think about kind of the classic rideshare models where drivers just choose based on their own incentives, where they spend their time and where quality of service is good. They're going to spend their time and provide good service to places that can afford them. And so you have to build the right market mechanisms and the right market interventions in order to provide good quality of service and good access to transportation to underserved areas, and figuring out those mechanisms and figuring out efficient ways to actually do that is super, super important. We spend a lot of time both doing that and then measuring that. It's a very interesting aspect of the work.
I mean, one natural corollary of everything Sar just said, which I agree completely, is sort of just the notion of multimodality in transit systems. That as you think about it, one individual's commute, that have a variety of mechanisms along the way, whether it be some fixed line, whether it be some rideshare, whether it be some pedal assist e-bike, whether, the range of different pieces that could put together. And of course, the main thing is to try to accomplish this in a frictionless way. I wouldn't want to say no transfers. I would just want to say that transfers that are seamless. And the extent to which that's possible is, technology can, better information systems can help facilitate that. And that's one of the, crucial roles that we could play. And sort of security of availability from any perspective, whether it's capacity on a vehicle and the like. And the other thing that's sort of driven home in a longer time scale is the role of autonomy. That if one thinks about the size of a bus, for example, to some extent, this is an old-fashioned calculation of the relative, number of passengers versus the cost of labor. And once all of a sudden that you have the potential of autonomous vehicles, which for bus routes on a dedicated lane take away some of the technological challenges of having a full purpose autonomous vehicle, opens another direction of potential. Whether we get there or not and what speed we get there maybe is a better way of phrasing that is a question. But in terms of a longer term transition, I do expect that will be playing a role as well.
Right, great. Thanks so much for the excellent points. Tim, is there something you would like to add, or?
No, I agree. I think David and Sar said it well. The fundamental challenge a lot of these networks face is thickness, or at least consistency of thickness. And I think that's where you start to see a lot of the marketplace mechanisms come and play a role. And I think about kind of the evolution of online marketplaces, the dominant model 5 or 10 years ago, really coming out of things like advertising, search, and social media. I think today you're starting to see marketplaces spring up around elastic capacity, and really trying to solve that problem of where do I have thickness, and if I don't have it permanently, can I redeploy resources? I think the classic example, or maybe even the most successful example, is Amazon with what they've done with AWS, which is sort of solve that elastic capacity problem. And I think you're starting to see more and more networks in rideshare and logistics try to do the same thing, where I'm rediverting that idle capacity when demand spikes or shrinks rapidly, to again both solve the sort of equity, which I think is a really good point that Sar brought up, as well as sort of the environmental and waste impacts.
All right, great. Thanks so much. There is a question from the audience, which is about kind of more definition of thickness. So when we talk about thickness in this area, what is the exact kind of definition? I'm assuming it's more about supply, or also maybe on the demand side, right?
So it depends. In my work, I usually define it as the rate at which buyers and sellers arrive at the market, or in transportation case, the rate at which people would like to take trips and the rate at which drivers or vehicles become available. And there isn't. I mean, it's not something that if you look at kind of the literature, you'll find like a very strict definition. Different people define it in different ways, but it's something about that. And you can read kind of in between the lines and see that the way I think about this is related to queuing in some markets and some outputs like that. So yeah, so basically the rates at which kind of transactions happen and people arrive at the market and how it influences the market outcomes, prices and stuff like that and so forth.
Yep, for us at Convoy, it's similar. There's a time element. Thickness for us really means at any given time, sort of what's our opportunity to optimize across units of work within the marketplace. And so for us, those units of work are delivery, point A to point B. If each of those were treated as individual units, or if they arrived in our marketplace at very different times, we'd have minimal opportunity to create efficiencies, to create routes. But if we can observe a lot of those units of work at the same time, then before they are released into the market or as they're released into the market, we can build a lot of efficiencies. And so that's where we can understand where is our supply, match it to demand, where can we link those deliveries together to create things like round trips or out and backs, really efficient routing. So thickness for us is some both rate of arrival and just what's the relative size of both supply, how can we choose across to drivers as well as demand, what's the unit of work.
All right, great, thank you so much. So any other question about the background and kind of introduction before we move on to like a next topic? Also, I want to make a quick announcement that David can be with us until 1:40. So if you have questions for David, make sure you ask them in the next 15 minutes or so. All right, so if there's no other question or comment on this topic, I'd like to change the topic a little bit to discuss the impact of theory on practice in this area and vice versa. So many members of our audience are in academia, so they spend their days developing models, thinking carefully about how to model a system, develop sophisticated algorithms and mechanisms. So I'm sure they'd be interested to know basically what are the impacts of academic work in industry and also again, vice versa. So just to be a bit more concrete, it would be great if you could share with us any example that you may have in mind of like a situation in which you like a sophisticated, well-designed algorithm was used instead of a kind of a first strike solution, and all of a sudden the system got actually a lot better. So kind of a positive story on the impact of careful design, or vice versa. So there was an algorithm that was supposed to do very well and it was supposed to change everything, but upon further testing or even implementing it, it kind of didn't do much better than like a very basic solution.
I can jump in first on this one, and maybe I'll start with the things that didn't work. We seem to have a much longer list of those ideas than the ones that did, but I think I can talk about a recent example. Sort of last year, we redesigned our auction system for how we match. So just high level, shipments come into our marketplace. They're listed there for drivers. Drivers can observe information about them and then either agree to do the work for a posted price or they can submit a bid. So kind of a blend of posted price versus sealed bid auctions. And this is a classic waiting time problem where when you observe a bid, you have a decision to make. Do you accept that or do you wait for a better bid to come in the future? We decided to redesign that and try to add transparency to that mechanism for the driver. And so we came up with a model that had many rounds where we would have an auction round. It would start at a posted time, it would end at a posted time, there would be a decision, all the participants in the auction at the end of the round would then receive information. Did they win? Did they lose? Did the round close, or did it fail to close? Then it would roll over to a future round. And so from a theoretical perspective, this was much more elegant. It allowed for sort of more information to be shared up front with the participants. And so when you're thinking about the truck driver who's trying to plan their schedule, it adds a lot of information. I know exactly when I'll hear back from Convoy. I'll know when my uncertainty will resolve over my schedule. And so if I have more information, in theory, you would expect to see better price discovery. You'd expect to see drivers reveal their true cost to serve in that way. And so we'd spent a lot of time designing this, testing it. Anytime you test anything in a marketplace, as I'm sure this audience understands, there's a lot of complexities. It's hard to tease out the sort of competitive elements. And it did very well in our sort of short run tests. And so we ended up rolling it out. Fast forward, I said this is an example from a year ago. Fast forward to today, we've largely moved away from that. And the reason is it's a very complicated game that we are asking these truck drivers to play, where we're already asking them to participate in an auction, which is often different than like a rideshare study. Imagine if your Uber driver had to submit a bid, and there's that time lag in there that just doesn't exist, that trucking does allow. So we have some room to play with potentially more sophisticated matching mechanisms, because we're not trying to make matches in milliseconds. We have minutes and hours to do that. But it's a complicated game, and by adding what was sort of theoretically more attractive, it became even more complicated. And so it really ended up not delivering the results we want. We found out that, at the end of the day, the participants that we wanted to play this game with just didn't want to play it with us. It's very difficult to explain to a truck driver why, hey, there's sort of all these elegant outcomes you observe at the macro level, but if the participants in the marketplace just don't want to engage, or if you add just a much more higher cognitive load, things break down. So, in hindsight, we got the theory right, we got the testing right, sort of all of the short run signals were correct, but at the end of the day, you have to understand the sort of institutional framework that you're releasing this theory into. And so we ended up reverting back to not a naive approach, but definitely a much more simpler auction mechanism, fewer rules, less information. From a theory perspective, you would say that participants have a smaller information set, there's less transparency, but there's also less cognitive load. And if we're asking these truck drivers to participate in many of these games simultaneously, which they do on our marketplace, it becomes just much easier for them to transact with us. And so the simpler model ended up outperforming the more elegant solution over time.
I mean, I might push back on the framing of the question altogether a bit, in that, I mean, it isn't a theory by what you do simple-minded. In some sense, I think of theory's role as a way of sort of trying to shine a light on basic, and I'm an algorithmicist more than anything else, that on sort of algorithmic principles and fundamental tools that can play a role. So let me give an example. So, integer programming would be great if we could solve everything at scale, but it can't. But one framework, let's say in the context of 0-1 integer programs, that has had time and again is outperformed more simple-minded approaches, ranges from how you get really important signal from being able to solve the linear programming relaxation, and whether that's just highlighting a set of variables that you then have a restricted integer program to solve, restricted to that, whether you use randomized rounding and you interpret those 0-1 values as probabilities in some creative way. This is a cast of tools, and to, especially if you think about the randomized rounding approach, it really was a theoretical result that framed that there's a win here, and that you have this important element to your toolkit. And so it's really a question of understanding sort of the juxtaposition of theory and practice, that Yeah, if I try to set up a theoretical model to solve it and I design a sophisticated algorithm, most times it's not going to I mean, and then the word a lot, in your framing, is it a setting where adding 3%, 5% improvement is a big win, or is that just a minor win? And sort of being able to do that. And so in many cases, sort of more sophisticated algorithmic and mechanism design is going to be important at the margins, or is most likely to be important at the margins. The only question is, how big are those margins, and how much it's worth your while for complexity that you're introducing.
Yeah, I think in our case, one of the things is that we did realize that we're solving kind of, we've become, so at VIA, we're very, very good at solving versions of the traveling salesperson problem, because we do shared rides. So we try to do that very efficiently, and we're actually very good at doing that in real time at scale, to the degree that kind of pre-COVID, we were twice as efficient as we. Even though our market share was very small compared to Uber and Lyft in Manhattan, for example, we did more shared rides than both of them together. And so, like, in terms of rides that actually end up being shared. So we're very, very good at solving these versions of the traveling salesperson problem in real time. And the interesting thing is that we always thought, and everyone kind of always talks about how if you have more time, you can actually solve it better. So you'd think that solving a pre-booking problem, so not getting rides in real time, but planning for tomorrow, knowing everything in advance, but planning for tomorrow's rides, which is something that happens in other instances, that should be an easier problem, because you have more time, you can spend more time solving that problem. But it turns out that in transportation, the uncertainty about how long it takes to perform certain tasks turns, if you get very good at solving a traveling salesperson problem, you end up creating manifests or creating task lists or creating a ride plan that's just impossible to actually follow, because there's a lot of uncertainty. So actually, even though we were very, very good at solving this traveling salesperson problem, the problem that you need to solve when we solve the problem a day in advance is actually a robust optimization problem, and pay more attention to the uncertainty of how long things take than pay attention to how efficiently you can actually solve it when you know exactly how long it will take. So it's a very interesting, you can say, we failed, like the better algorithmic solution actually failed, but it didn't fail in the sense that didn't work. It just was solving the wrong problem. The problem is actually that the uncertainty is so big in transportation, because in part, the infrastructure is a big unknown, and we always talk about kind of two-sided, three-sided markets. There is currently the infrastructure, the roads are not part of the market. As I would say, 99.9% of economists would tell you that we need congestion charges. And yet 0% of people who drive to work every day would like to see congestion charges. And so very small percentage of politicians think that we should have them, and even fewer locations than have those politicians actually have them. But that is inevitable. If we're going to have autonomous vehicles, then the question of then congestion will just explode, because basically you'd have like a very easy trade-off between parking and driving around. You can have your car driving around instead of parking, and it costs you a lot less than parking. Specifically in Manhattan, it costs a lot less than parking. So we actually have to at some point enter like the kind of the third or fourth side into the market, which is the actual capacity, infrastructure and capacity into that, and that can help us kind of shape a nice future. And kind of one more thing, I think maybe for Tim, the fact that people have a cognitive load and can't really bid correctly, that's the exact, in the future the industry can go and I think it will go exactly in the direction that the advertising industry has gone, which is you have the exchanges, and what you have is an exchange, but you also have the demand side platforms and the supply side platforms that help people bid and help people post the right type of auctions, right? You can, the fragmentation actually can creates like an opportunity to help people make better decisions, because you know, drivers are not that good at valuing things. We know that they know more than us, but if they have someone to whom they can convey their preferences a little bit better, and that someone can help them with a little bit more information about how to bid, then that works very nicely. And there are companies in the ride-sharing space that, for example, recommend to Uber drivers like which rides to take and which rides not to take, and where to go when they're empty. That's something that on the kind of so Via doesn't have like this two-sided market. We tell drivers where to go. We assign rides to them. We solve kind of a social planner's version of that problem, and by doing that, we get more efficient. But there are actually like those like buds of the next phase, which is having kind of helping the different sides of the market become more sophisticated in how they do their bidding. So it's all.
Yeah, you're definitely right. I agree. I think that's where it's heading. I think what we're seeing, and these are different labor pools, but if I were to abstract a little bit, a variety of models where on one hand you have a full-time contract employee, in one hand you have a contractor with full autonomy, and then sort of the ideal, I think that Sarah is saying, is you would want somewhere in the middle where you're providing sort of tools and recommendations to make the driver much more efficient, but they also have some ability to give feedback over preferences back into the system, and so they might choose sort of the length of their shift or where they're focusing geographically. But all of that gets inputted into the system, and so then it helps within those constraints optimize.
So I'm sorry to have to duck out at this point. It was a great conversation. I'm going to listen to the recording of the rest to hear what I missed, but a last minute medical appointment that I couldn't avoid interfered. So thank you all.
Thank you so much for David for joining us. Yeah, right. Thanks so much. All right, great. I think these are all excellent points. We do have some more questions, but we also want to leave time for audience to ask questions. I think there's already one question in the Q&A which I relay, but to everyone else, if you have a question, just feel free to raise your hand and we can enable speaking. So the question in the chat is about labor, and in particular, it's about compensating labor. So the question is that for ride-sharing platforms or other labor-intensive platforms like Convoy, what do you see how workers will be paid in the future? So are they going to remain as this kind of gig economy model, or is it going to be more like close to an employee type model? And what would be a good compromise between the platform and workers about this?
I can talk a little bit about the model, at least in long-haul trucking, which I think there are some important differences between rideshare. Today, there are sort of many different models. So kind of the most dominant one, though, is that the labor, the truck drivers, they are fully employed for themselves. So the kind of structure in the industry, it's called owner operator, which just means that I own my truck, I drive the truck, that's my income. The median size of a trucking company in the United States is 6 trucks. So these are very small organizations. It's typically, you know, myself and a family member or a friend, and we have a small business together. And so in that case, the role of companies like Convoy, and there are others out there that directly do sort of what Sar mentioned, where Convoy, we're a platform where you can come to find work. And so we are great for you to have access to demand that as a small business owner, you may not have access to, especially when it comes to interacting with large enterprises. There are companies out there that offer services then to these drivers to help them plan their schedule. They also often come with a mix of back-end services as well, because A truck driver wants to be driving a truck, not worrying about insurance and taxes and licensing. But kind of the key value there is exactly that. Where do I go next? How do I plan my schedule? Things like that. There is an a side of the industry. It's called sort of an asset driver, where you're a full employee. You do work for a large trucking company. This trucking company probably has hundreds or thousands of trucks, and you are an employee. You earn a salary. You earn benefits. It's fixed. Those companies at scale, in times where there's lots of demand, can be very efficient because their fixed costs are high, but their variable costs are very low. They have complete control over the driver, their schedule, where they go. In some ways, what Convoy is trying to do is move away from that model, in terms of that that labor model responds poorly when there are big swings in demand. If there are downturns, those drivers are still being paid. They're still on the books. The capacity is still on the books. Those trucks sit idle. So I think somewhere in the middle is where sort of the Convoy model fits in. But I think you're going to continue to see, at least in long haul trucking, you're going to continue to see a variety from full-time employee to individual owner, and then somewhere in there. Truck drivers generally value their autonomy. They want to have control over when and where and how they drive. And so there is often a trade-off for them between kind of income certainty and autonomy, and many of them will pay a premium in terms of, an economist would tell you that people are risk adverse and they would prefer to smooth their income. And if you spend any time with drivers, you'll find that the economic theory breaks down. They really enjoy that chase, and probably some to their detriment in certain cases. But both of those sort of personas exist in the industry.
It's actually interesting because the GPS is what enabled the big kind of companies to even exist, right? In the old days, before GPS, before you had a way to actually track when and where your truck was, the owner-operator was the only model for long-haul trucking. And GPS enabled kind of a new model in which, in the old days, you couldn't figure out where the truck goes. And so having an employee driver that can tell you, well, it took me another extra day to get from California to New York because of traffic and road work and stuff like that. And there was like no way that you could know that they just like went to sleep for a day and a half somewhere in the middle. So now you can. So now there's like this new model that's enabled. With respect to kind of the more like ride sharing type stuff drivers, we've seen the same trade-off, which is we know that so first, Via operates in many different markets. Most of in our consumer markets, our drivers, in some of them, our drivers were contractors. In some of them, we already had employee drivers. In some countries where you cannot have contractors, we had employees. So basically, regulation has a lot to do with what we choose to do. It's actually not, it's not that hard to have. It's just solving a different problem. When you solve for the kind of contractor problem, all you have to, what you kind of aim to do is to figure out how many drivers you'll need for tomorrow. You can figure out what type of incentives to offer so that enough drivers actually show up. You can do it for tomorrow. You can do planning at different time horizons and actually adjust kind of the available supply based on what how they respond to incentives in different timescales. But you can also instead just solve the kind of capacity planning, so like a classic capacity planning problem, and combine that with capacity planning for vehicles. And as electric vehicles come online more and more, the kind of how to charge vehicles and the level of charge in trucks, in cars' batteries, so that you can charge vehicles at the right time at the right cost, drive the vehicles at the right times at the right cost, and have enough drivers to actually do that. So theoretically, there's actually no problem, and also in practice, there's no problem. We do observe this kind of thing where you'd say that maybe truck drivers kind of value their freedom. What they end up doing is, they get paid less and they also work less. And we used to see that at VIA quite a bit. There are all sorts of studies. You can actually like download reports from the taxi and limousine commissions. Drivers that drove for VIA worked harder and earned much more per hour than, and basically that was available for them all the time. And still most drivers chose to work for Uber and Lyft and to earn less, for the freedom to not accept rides here and there, which is basically the freedom to take free time whenever they want, even within a day. It's not even like kind of, you'd think that maybe kind of truck drivers like choose to work fewer days a week or maybe fewer weeks out of the year. Even the number of minutes they work within an hour is something that when people get a chance to do, they buy some free time, or basically they choose to work a little bit less, work less hard and get paid less. So it's an interesting, kind of an interesting observation that seems to be universal, at least within the transportation industry in the US.
All right, great. Thanks so much. Let me ask a quick follow-up question, which is, you mentioned that you do have markets that have the employee model. There's a question about profit margin. So does this model kind of hurt profit margin for VIA or no? Is this like it?
So again, the reality is that we don't choose the model. It hurts profit margins, but you could say that any type of regulation theoretically hurts profit margins, and also allowing drivers to drive 15-hour shifts potentially hurts profit margins. But you just, you know, if you can't do it, you can't do it, and you probably don't want to do it anyway. So the reality is that in markets where the contractor model is available, it would not make sense for us to have employee drivers, because we would be, you know, we would be playing the game with like one hand and one arm tied behind our back, where the competition just doesn't do that. Where we have to do that, where we have to have employee drivers, we do that, and that works. But then as long as the whole market works, it works. The interesting thing is that actually most of our business is actually no longer, we're no longer in the business of having drivers. We provide our technology, so that's another kind of way in which we get even farther away from taking a side in that problem, which is we sell our technology to bus companies, to cities, to municipalities. We provide our technology, they bring their buses, they bring their drivers, they bring all of that. And in reality, most of those drivers are employees. They have pensions, they have everything, and you know, it works for everyone. So I guess that works.
All right, great. Thank you so much. There's another question which is about how, it's a more ride-sharing question. So how to interpolate ride-sharing with third-party systems, such as like restaurant reservations. And this is not about like Uber Eats, which of course kind of does both, but more generally for other ride-sharing systems and such third-party systems.
So I think a big part of it is, I think eventually it will happen a little bit more than it does today. And I think the way it will happen is through, that's kind of my private view. I don't know if I represent VIA's view of whether it's going to happen or not. But there's, I think that the way in which it's going to happen is by having more marketplaces, basically, and having more flexible capacity sold on an exchange, either in real time or with some forward commitments. And in order for that to happen, you have to think about kind of what the business of transportation is having multiple components. There is kind of there's the demand side of people figuring out, or people needing to either move things from some place to some other place, and they make choices, right? Their timing and timing is a big part of that. They would like we usually think about these as being non-choices. Like I have to do something, I have to go to work, but you usually have at least you have kind of a timing aspect to that choice. And sometimes, even though we all think we have to do something, we realize that if it's very complex, then we don't have to do it. For example, wherever we ask people, and we run a lot of surveys about what other mode of transportation would you have used if you couldn't use VIA for this trip that you just took? And there are places like Arlington, Texas, where VIA is the only provider of public transit. So you know, some people don't have alternatives, and still 25% of them would say, I would have not taken that trip, including if it's a trip that they say is for like health purposes and stuff like that. So anyway, so there's the demand side, there's the supply side. You want an exchange that solves that, but you also need a few other things. So for example, as Tim said, the supply side and the demand side don't always know how to express, they either are not very good or don't have the time or the mental capacity, or just are not fully aware of all of the information. They need help expressing their preferences. For example, bidding on tasks. On the demand side, it's the exact same thing. People can't always kind of completely, let's say that you let one of the, like not all of the shippers would always know how to rank the different like prices versus quality of service versus, I don't know, timing, maybe quality of service has other aspects other than timing. They don't always know how to do that. So there's a role for some intermediaries on both sides of the market. And then there's a big part of the, you have to have a mechanism to solve disputes. So in the classic taxi business, usually cities take the role of solving disputes. In the ride-sharing business, the ride-sharing companies somehow decided to take it on themselves to solve disputes. And you see a lot of complaints from the different sides of the markets that whoever you know, basically it's not a neutral, like they're not a neutral side in that transaction. So sometimes there's kind of a systematic preference to solve dispute in one direction or the other. So you can take this whole kind of mechanism, you can break it apart and say we need a component, we need an exchange. We need some demand side elements. We need the supply side elements. We need this kind of dispute solution mechanism, arbitration mechanism. We need the regulators. We need the infrastructure side to be represented here as either congestion fees or maybe some other mechanism. Maybe also when you bid, you also bid on the rights to use a road, right? And things like that. And through kind of all of these mechanisms, you can together solve this like basically kind of advance the state of the market and advance efficiency in a way that helps us kind of move towards where we need to, literally.
All right, great. Thanks so much. So there is one more question about accidents that may happen during transportation, for example, traffic jam. How could platform take care of it from a mechanism design point of view? I think this is also a little bit related to the point that Sar was making about disputes.
I think.
So, yeah.
Actually, so if you want to be able to solve disputes, you need visibility into what happened in the process, right? So access to information is very important. On the other hand, and that's something that we haven't raised today, but privacy and privacy concerns are a huge thing in transportation, and so you know, we need to figure out mechanisms that on one hand would allow enough transparency to allow someone to solve disputes. We need the right incentives for people to give access to their information, both on the supply side and the demand side. And then, there's a room for accidents. There's a room for, whenever there's risk, there's a room for someone to, be an intermediary and take on some of the risk that they want. There is room as long as there is enough visibility, right? Like if there's no visibility, then kind of, there's a potential for market breakdown and kind of like adverse selection and things like that might cause us to not be able to have intermediaries that buy and sell the risk in the form of insurance. But maybe that's another component that just needs to be there, which is kind of someone who'd be willing to buy or sell that insurance. Or sell. People are usually willing to buy.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
I would just add on that to the importance of having the information and balancing that with privacy. To resolve disputes, you certainly need to know what happened, but even before that, you need to be able to observe if there's an incident in your marketplace or on your platform. And so sometimes that's not always easy to do, and you want to be able to observe it independently of the participant reporting it. Because often in some cases, the participants are incentivized to report those issues, and sometimes they're incentivized not to. And so you need the ability to monitor as a platform and know when those things are happening, but then you do have to balance that with the privacy of the participants in that marketplace. So it's a hard problem. I think in cases where these are digital marketplaces, it becomes easier because it's just easier to instrument and collect the data. But anytime rideshare logistics, there's always a physical element of this. And so that's where it becomes really difficult. How do you instrument the real world in some sense to be able to monitor?
All right, great. Thanks so much. I think Ozan has a question. Ozan, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a brief question. And this is somewhat related to the structure of the organizations we see in this space. I'm under the impression that in some platforms/organizations, the supply side and the demand side are somewhat decoupled. By that, what I mean is, the routing teams and the pricing teams could be, for instance, separate. I don't know if this is the case for Convoy or Via, but that's my broader impression. Now, arguably, the joint optimization of the two sides would improve the welfare of all market participants. This, however, adds to the complexity of the problem, and this may be one reason for which people are, proceeding with this more decoupled systems. And my question is really about the loss that one incurs due to such decoupling, or how do you balance the welfare and complexity in such settings? I guess this is what I'm trying to reason about.
So I can say how we're doing it. We're actually, when we do our routing, we have our own weights for how to balance the riders' preferences and the system efficiency. The drivers don't really have, the drivers, and as far as we're concerned, drivers and system efficiency work kind of hand in hand. I could think of a mechanism in which, again, if you have a rich enough option, right, you could have someone say, I'm willing to take you from point A to point B with 1 mile detour with up to 1 mile detour for $10, and with up to 5 mile detour for maybe $2 less or something like that. And then a rider would have to choose explicitly about the preferences for time and uncertainty and detours and all of that. We just do it ourselves. So again, we take kind of the role of a social planner of sorts. But what we have started doing is doing it in a personalized way. So for example, we know that some people are willing to walk a little bit more in order to, and they care more about when they're going to arrive somewhere, and they're willing to walk a little bit more. Some people don't like walking, and so by allowing some people to walk more, people who prefer walking and are willing to trade that for an early arrival time, we can improve the overall system performance, because if they walk more, the cars have to do smaller detours, and then everyone wins, including other people in the car that have smaller detours and also arrive at the destination earlier. Again, we solve that by actually having one team solve the one big problem, by not separating into two problems. We end up stuck with the task of assigning weights, like whose problem is more important and by how much.
Yeah, we solve the problem a little bit differently. I mean, the mechanics of it are we do make sure that the supply signals, basically the supply constraints in any given market, are reaching it to the sort of pricing function and how we make decisions about when to bring demand into the marketplace. So in some sense, it's ideally you would want a two-sided marketplace where the transaction is happening simultaneously. For a Convoy, it's somewhat sequential, where there's a decision to bring the demand into the marketplace and then the decision on how to match that. The real tricky part here, and this is where we're still in progress, and the question was sort of how do you design a mechanism, is we can do that internally, where once Convoy is sort of the well-informed social planner. So as we are deciding to bring demand in, we're getting those internal signals from what capacity exists. The question then is, do you keep that information internal, or do you reveal that to the source of demand, which in this case is Convoy's customer, the shipper itself? So does your customer just observe you making optimal decisions based on what you know the constraints are in your marketplace, or do you actually expose those and say, hey, this is why you are getting this price, this is why you are seeing, and again, like in theory, full information is better, and then you're allowing that participant to make better decisions. That's maybe where you're also trying to run a profitable business. And so I think that's where the theory and the art play a little bit. But the joke internally is, is Convoy a two-sided marketplace, or is it two one-sided marketplaces that sit next to each other? So we're always trying to aim for the former.
All right, very nice. Thank you very much. We have many other questions, but we're also mindful of the time of our panelists and also the audience. So if there's no other question, please join me in thanking our panelists one more time. And thank you all for joining us for this insightful discussion.
Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you for joining us.